Hi, so it was just Christmas and we got all these new board games, and one of them was Snakes and Ladders, and I want to talk to you about the educational value of Snakes and Ladders. I mean, it's a very simple game, and I was going to talk about some more complicated games, but I thought I'd start with this one just to give you an idea of sort of the types of things I wanted to talk about. So let's talk about the rules of Snakes and Ladders first. So just to remind you, it's a very simple game. Let's pretend it's two players, and every player rolls the dice, and whatever they roll, they move forward that number of squares. Okay, and then the other person rolls, and every time you touch the foot of a ladder, you go up. Every time you touch the head of a snake, you go down. And the goal is to end up at the very last square at the top. Okay, and then there's an extra rule where if this player rolls a 2 as well, okay, and lands on the same square as the other person, that person has to start again. Okay, so those rules are pretty simple. And I want to talk about how these rules sort of maybe affect the educational value or maybe the playability of the game. So if you notice, once the game's decided who goes first, or someone goes first, once that decision's been made, there's no actually any other decisions to be made at all in this game. Okay, so and you're just basically rolling the dice and seeing what happens. So the only real, I guess, skill in this game would be to remind the other opponent of the rules sometimes. So for example, if you land on the other person's square, I guess, I don't know, it might be considered good sportsmanship just to remind them, even if they land on your square, that you'd have to start at the beginning. But a lot of it is just about remembering the rules. You might get something out of sort of experiencing the randomness of the dice. Okay, but then other than that, there's not really any decision making after that. So it's maybe good for kids to learn the rules and count squares and move things like that. But it doesn't have a lot of replayability value. So it's not a good idea to just keep playing the same game over and over again. If you already know the rules, like the process of learning the rules is educational, but just keep repeating the rules is not necessarily educational. But if you do keep repeating the rules, there might be some interesting questions you might want to consider, and that's what maybe make this game a bit more playable. You might want to consider, if you know who goes first, okay, who has the advantage in this game? Okay, so I guess once this question's been resolved, there's not really anything else to this game. And the answer is actually kind of interesting because at first you think, okay, well, the player who goes first should have the advantage. Obviously, because, well, it just seems like the more rolls of the dice you have, the sooner you'll get to the end, and you should have one more roll than the other person when you finally get to the end. So going first will give you that extra roll, and so you should end up at the end first. Okay, so that's an interesting thing, and that's a good step for understanding it. But then actually, if you think about the rule says if you land on someone else, they have to go back to the beginning. And going back to the beginning should be a bad thing most of the time. Or it just seems obviously a bad thing. So actually going second, you have more of a chance of stepping on the other person and making them go back to the beginning. Whereas if you went first, you can't step on anyone because there's no one in front of you. Okay. So this is something very worth investigating, and you can talk someone through this. And you might say, okay, well, wait a second, but if I went to 3 and then the other person just stepped on me and then they go from there, aren't they in the same situation that I was in? So how could I have had the advantage if I just put them in the same situation that I was in? Okay, and that's a really good argument, and it says that if that happens, you don't really have an advantage. But what happens is you might not catch up to the person until you're both really far ahead. Okay, and the person who goes first is more likely to be ahead. And so when you are far away from the beginning, and then you get landed on by the other person, then it's devastating. Okay, it's like going down a really big snake. Yeah. So I think those two questions at that level of reasoning is pretty much all there is to the game. And I would love it if someone came up with a very precise argument to actually show for sure that the second player had an advantage, or actually, in fact, the first player had an advantage. Okay, so that's all I want to say about snakes and ladders.